Welcome everyone, both in person and virtually. Thank you for coming to this event, and welcome to the 2022 Planetary Health Annual Meeting at Harvard University. Thank you all for coming to this session entitled The Changing Worlds Event, led by Emma Lawrance, Gary Belkin, and several colleagues. I'm going to hand it over to Emma and Gary now.
Many thanks, and thank you so much for having us, for everyone joining in the room and virtually. So my name is Dr. Emma Lawrance. I'm the Mental Health Innovations Fellow at the Institute of Global Health Innovation, Imperial College London, and I lead the Climate Cares program, looking at the intersection of climate change and mental health. And it's been my pleasure and privilege to work with colleagues really around the world over the last few years to better understand how young people are experiencing the climate crisis and how this interacts with their mental health. So I'll be chairing this session today as we talk through the ways that we've been finding to work together in a really global coalition to understand in each context youth mental health and agency in the climate crisis, and also the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has obviously been a huge background context to the last few years. If we can go to the next slide, please, Ans. I'll first introduce some of the colleagues that we have both joining in person and joining online. And you can see the different countries people are coming from. So Renzo and Crisel, I believe, are both in the room with you from the Philippines. We have Sandeep and Quinta from the Caribbean team, as well as Professor Emmanuel Cummings, and actually also online from the Caribbean team, we have Mike and Natalie. Besides myself, joining from the UK study team, but actually based in Australia. So coming very, very early in her morning is Ans, joining from Perth, and Britt finally joining from Stanford in the US. And later on, we'll hear from Gary Belkin as well. He's been involved in both the US study, but also leads COP Squared to tell you about that initiative. So I hope you can see it's quite a diverse group that we've got coming to you in this hybrid event, and you'll hear from most of these important collaborators throughout this event. So if we can go to the next slide. But first, we want to hear from you. So we want this to be as dynamic as it can be in the context of the limitations of technology and time. But if you can all take out your phone, whether you're joining in person or online, and go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and you'll be prompted to enter a code. And we've put that in the chat, but hopefully you can also see it's 3872 0128, 3872 0128. And then Ans is going to helpfully switch to the Menti slides. And what we're going to do is through Menti is just want to get a sense across this split room of who is in the room and where you're coming from in the first instance. And also importantly, today's session is really centered around feelings, around how we're feeling and thinking, and how young people are thinking and feeling in the context of the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic, and how this may differ across regions, how this may interact with mental health, with a sense of agency to respond to these challenges. And so we want to ask you, how are you feeling today? And how do you feel in the context of climate change and the climate emergency? Please share how you're feeling and how you feel to be here, and check in with yourself. And there might be a range of feelings. You might be excited to be here. You might also feel sort of a range of feelings that come from sort of considering the planetary health community, but also the planetary emergency that we face. So please feel free to share anything that's coming up for you. I hope you can see, I can see actually on my screen a lot of different feelings coming up of tired, excited, but I hope that maybe if you can refresh arms, it'll come up for you as well. Gritty, that's a good one. Expectant, inspired, I'm seeing frustrated, confused, optimistic, here we go, sad, challenged, tired. There's a lot happening, I think, in this conference. Anxious and scared. So feelings coming up around the climate crisis as well. Determined, bedazzled, energized, low, confused, hopeful, frustrated. So there's a huge variety of emotions in the context of maybe being at the Planetary Health Alliance event, considering all the challenges that we're tackling and being part of the community of researchers and practitioners, maybe lived experience experts who are all coming together. So many thanks for that. If we go to the next slide, we want to just hear, first of all, a bit more about who's in the room. So before you came in today to this event, how much awareness do you have of the synergies between action for a safer climate and mental health? Do you have a lot of awareness, some awareness, or you're completely new to this topic? And again, Ans, you might need to, at some point, refresh to see as that comes in. Okay, so we're actually split at the moment. Looks like mostly between a lot of awareness or new to the topic. So that's great. So hopefully, you know, also in the conversations later, we can be sharing kind of learning across people who are more familiar and less familiar. Okay, great. So if we go, and please continue, you can continue to engage and vote, and we can come back to that and you'll be able to see how everyone sort of shook out on these things later. If we go to the next one, we just want you to type in what country you're from. As you've seen, we've got different settings for the research that we're presenting to you today, and we'd love to hear where you're all joining us from. Okay, so again, it's a little bit of a delay, I think, but I'm seeing England, Italy, Indonesia, US, Belgium, Trinidad and Tobago. So already there's quite a few different contexts that we're joining from, and part of today will be to discuss and understand how those contexts may inform and interact with the kind of research that we do and how we need to be thinking in the planetary health community and what we've been learning from our process. So many thanks, and keep adding. I know there's some more coming up on my side. I think there's a little bit of a delay, but thank you so much, everyone, for that. So Arns, if we go back now to the main deck of slides, we'll do some more Menti things later, but if we go back to the talk, that'd be great. Thank you. Great. So if we go on to the the next slide. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and the sort of context that the work has been done. So Climate Care's based at Imperial, but with this kind of global coalition of partners, is an interdisciplinary program of work that aims to better understand, support, and respond to or even transform mental health outcomes in the current climate and ecological crises. And we're trying to do this across both generating an evidence base for understanding these deep interconnections between climate change and mental health and well-being, and also taking that knowledge from both us and others into co-designing interventions and support tools, and also into raising awareness, changing policies and education across different stakeholders. So if we go to the next slide, Ans. In 2020, we were very, very keen to, I guess, get some of the first data at the time on understanding how young people were thinking and feeling about climate change. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence that there was distress, and we'd seen all of the school strikes in 2019, etc. And we're hearing and seeing and feeling in ourselves and the mental health charities that I was working with and others that young people were feeling this in a range of different ways, and some very acutely, but there was no big data sets on this. There was no kind of quantitative data. And so what we set out to do was understand the range of ways that young people were thinking and feeling. We wanted to start in the UK, where we're based, and then sort of spread out. But of course, in 2020, we were also in the context of not only a climate crisis ongoing, but also the COVID-19 pandemic. And that also presented an opportunity to answer questions that we were getting a lot about, well, aren't people just going to worry in general and then grab onto whatever seems sort of close to them to worry about? So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, won't the worry have kind of shifted away from the climate crisis and onto COVID-19? And we were really interested to understand whether there were similarities and differences to the ways people were thinking and feeling about the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic, and how these might interact with each other and interact with the sort of sense of agency we have to respond, and mental health and well-being. So what we did was co-develop with young people across the UK a survey that we issued in sort of August to October 2020. And since then, we've again worked with these global partners to amend and to adapt that to different contexts. And that's what we'll be hearing about today, both that process of collaboration and how we've worked together, and also the results that we're getting from the study so far. And ultimately, we wanted to use this understanding to co-create interventions to better support young people's resilience and coping strategies, and help them reflect and explore their thoughts and feelings in the context of these crises, imagine the kind of futures that they want to create, and build that sense of agency and opportunities to respond in the ways that they would like to. So we've been very fortunate at Climate Cares to again co-design with young people a guided journal intervention to do just that. And that was very much interlinked with this project. So if we can go to the next slide, Ans. The approach that we've taken, and we'll hear more from the different partners on this, is in general, Climate Cares has a global advisory board. We also really focus on participatory research. So as I said, all the surveys and indeed the other outputs have been co-designed with diverse and local young people's advisory groups. This is something the other partners can talk about, that approach in their regions as well. So we did this online UK survey first, but then have worked with the partners, and really led by the partners, not by us, to do the translation and adaptation and contextualization. And you'll hear from each team on how that's been done in their context. And yeah, just to also say that one of the ways that we really wanted to work, and that we want to bring into this conversation of discussing kind of the ways that we can work together as a planetary health community and a diverse community, is to make sure we're doing things that are in the spirit of collaboration, in the spirit of open access, and making data available so that everyone can benefit. And if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Ans Verkammen, who is presenting from very early in the morning in Australia, and my core collaborator on the Changing Worlds UK study. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ans.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. And I can't really see the room, but good to meet everyone in the room, and welcome everyone online. So I'll just talk you through the results of the UK survey study. Okay, so in the UK, we distributed our survey via adverts on social media and through our own networks of mental health and youth organizations, as well as with the help of a professional survey panel service that allowed us to obtain a total of 530 valid responses. We did some quality control, so we had a few more responses, but obviously wanted to make sure that we only included sort of legitimate responses. Our respondents were between the age of 16 and 24, with a mean of 21 years old. We had a small majority of women in the sample, but we also had a relatively large percentage of people who identified as LGBTQ+. The sample that we had was also more ethnically diverse than the general UK population. Most of our young respondents were living with their family or were living with their peers, so at halls of residence at university, for instance. We also asked them whether they had ever been diagnosed with a mental health condition or had received treatment for a mental health condition, and that was the case for 30% of the sample that we surveyed. Just to give you a little bit of background on who that sample was and where they're located, so you can see from the map that they're located throughout the UK. Okay, so we first asked about climate distress as well as distress related to the pandemic. So using the same kinds of questions to measure psychological distress with respect to both of these issues. And we found that climate change related distress in general was higher than pandemic related distress. And this was at the start, or actually really at the height of the pandemic. The statements that young people associated with the pandemic were really about experiencing loss of quality of life and grief, which is, I'm not entirely sure you can see my cursor, but you can sort of see that here. So there was more agreement with the statements around loss of quality of life. And feeling loss or grief in general, which has, obviously there were restrictions with respect to the pandemic, so that makes sense. Statements that reflected climate distress related more to seeing upsetting media stories and images around them, but also feeling a sense of personal responsibility and guilt about their own contributions to the climate crisis, and sort of responsibility and guilt were less obvious for the pandemic, or less distressing, at least for the pandemic. And the other thing, and Emma alluded to it, this concept of agency, this sense that you can do something about this, was also lower for the climate crisis than for the pandemic. In general, we found that the women who responded to the survey were more distressed than men when it came to climate change. But interestingly, because, we obviously saw some level of psychological distress. However, the median scores across the sample were still just mild to moderate. So there's not a high level of distress there. And the overall impact that was reported on their daily functioning was also moderate for the pandemic and mild for climate change. So we asked them to rate that directly. Okay. Now, then we asked about we asked them to rate the impacts and experience that they've had with climate change and the pandemic. The most commonly, and we split it up into negative and positive impacts, because we wanted to understand sort of the full complement of experiences that people had had. And the selection of experiences and impacts was informed by our Young Persons Advisory Group. So the most commonly noted negative impacts of climate change were worry about the general lack of action. So from governments, for instance, again, seeing upsetting images in social media or regular media, the perception that they themselves as individuals could do very little, general worry about the future. So what does this future look like in the context of the climate crisis? And then also seeing local environments that matter to them change for the worse. However, there were obviously also some positive experiences, or maybe it's not obvious, but in any case, there were some positive experiences relating to climate change. And they generally had to do with feeling sort of a sense of community or getting some benefits from participating in action. So for instance, they had a sense of improved well-being from participating in eco-friendly practices, which suggests a win-win for environmental and public health goals to some extent at least. Feeling more connected to nature, having more opportunities to learn about nature. Some noted subjectively better weather conditions. So in the UK, that could mean warmer summers, nicer weather. And then the last sort of commonly noted positive effect was feeling inspired or empowered by seeing other people around them take action in the fight against climate change. So a sense of not being alone in this. Okay. We were also interested not just in sort of their thoughts, but particularly into their feelings around climate change. So we looked at emotional reactions that young people associated with the two crises, so climate change and the pandemic. So the graph might be a little bit much to sort of take in one go, but basically it shows the difference in the percentage of respondents who reported each emotion. So it goes from isolated, disconnected, concerned, disappointed, hopeful, angry, a lot of different emotions. And so we wanted to see in this graph, I'm just showing which ones are more commonly noted in the pandemic versus more commonly noted in climate change. So the first one over here, isolated, very clearly more commonly noted as part of, their response to the pandemic, which makes sense because there were lots of restrictions. People were having to stay at home. What we're seeing more in response to climate change is feelings of guilt and feelings of shame, which has to do with, that sort of inability, that responsibility of contributing to the problem. And also quite strong feelings of sort of disgust But more positively, what was also very strong with response to climate change is engagement, which you can see here, and interest. So it does seem to indicate that, despite some very strong, what we would generally see as negative emotions, such as, being scared or disgusted about what's going on, they remain engaged and interested in the topic of climate change, which I think, we can all take as a positive. Okay, so moving on to agency. This is about knowing what to do, feeling in control in response to a stressor. We did also observe some differences. When it came to the pandemic, young people felt pretty knowledgeable and confident to do what was required of them, and also felt that their actions were having an effect. While those aspects of agency were relatively lacking in relation to climate change, young people did feel that they would be able to potentially influence others by taking action against climate change. And they also felt that their own actions would have an overall positive effect on how they felt and thought about things. Interestingly, we found that the young people who had a greater sense of overall agency in relation to climate change were also the ones who showed higher distress. And that was not the case when it came to the pandemic, where distress or concern was pretty similar in people with high or low agency, or basically to say that distress and agency were not really correlated with respect to the pandemic, but it was with respect to climate change. Again, this might suggest that having negative feelings or feeling distressed about climate change does not mean that people disengage from the issue. In fact, you could say that a certain degree of worry or concern may be necessary to maintain that level of engagement and interest and a sense of agency within the climate crisis. So very finally, one specific finding I just wanted to highlight from the UK study was that we also found a link between generalized anxiety and the extent to which the pandemic and climate change affected young people's day-to-day life. So again, we asked them to assess whether their thoughts and feelings about each of the issues had an impact on their day-to-day functioning. So we gave some examples, does it affect your sleep? How is it affecting school or work or socializing or hobbies, etc. So really about sort of like, is it really impinging on your day-to-day activities? In the sample that we had here, we found that climate change thoughts were really not causing issues in day-to-day life, and this was irrespective of the young person's generalized anxiety. However, for the pandemic, we did actually see more disturbance of day-to-day sort of activities for those with higher levels of anxiety. I think I will just leave that here. We can, looking for input, thoughts, questions, comments later. But thanks very much. And I'm going to pass on to the next presenter.
Hello, everybody. So now from the virtual room, let's come back to the actual room. I'm Renzo Ginto. I am from the St. Luke's Medical Center in the Philippines, together with Crisel Penamante, our research fellow for climate change and mental health. This time, we're going to present a work in progress. So a while ago, you heard a finished study from Britain, and now you will be hearing what is happening in the Philippine study and the adaptations that we are making. This session is about cross-cultural understanding of mental health. And so it's important to, really contextualize and adapt a questionnaire that was developed by the UK team to different contexts, for instance, in the case of the Philippines. Next slide, please. So one unique, Philippines is, as you may have known, is a country at the heart of the climate crisis. You look at the German Watch rankings each year, we're always at the top 10 in terms of climate risk. Next slide. And, for the Philippine study, we are retaining the focus on climate anxiety, of course, but also the pandemic aspect. But as you can see in this diagram, we are also adding a third kind of layer or dimension, which is the political crisis that the country is currently facing. And so, as you can see here, the Philippine study will investigate the psychological responses of Filipino youth ages 18 to 24. We decided to increase the cutoff because if we are going to include the 16-year-olds and 17s, we're going to encounter a lot of questions from the ethics board in the country. And we want to explore the psychological responses to the co-occurrence of planetary crisis, pandemic crisis, and political or post-election crisis. As you can see, there are 3P crisis, triple 3P crisis happening in the Philippines. Another P. Next slide, please. And, just to remind you about the situation in the country, it's unfortunate. Just 3 days ago, upon my arrival here in Boston, the Philippines again was struck by a super typhoon, already claimed around 100 lives as we speak, and really enormous losses in terms of infrastructure, livelihood, and of course, health and well-being. Next slide. And we know that when these disasters do strike, families get affected, houses get destroyed, communities get forcibly displaced. And, you can imagine not just the physical impact, but also the mental and emotional trauma that these disasters do, create and generate. Some of these traumatic experiences take, weeks or months or even years to subside, or for people to recover from. Next, please. Next slide, please. But apart from the mental and emotional trauma caused by extreme weather events like typhoons, there's already a growing recognition of how slow onset climate change. The climate change that is invisible. It's not dramatic. It's not the type that you see in the front pages of the newspaper. Is already affecting the health of the brains and hearts of Filipinos. And so, I just want to acknowledge one of my close collaborators, John Aruta, an environmental psychologist, and we've been really building this field of climate and mental health, particularly in the Philippines, again, expanding our understanding beyond disasters, looking at, for example, climate anxiety and other forms of psychological responses to the changing climate. Next, please. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this study that was published last year in The Lancet in 2021. The Hickman et al. Study examined the young people of 10 countries in the world. And what the study found out is that among those 10 countries, the young people of the Philippines are the most climate anxious in the world. Around 90%, at least moderately to at most extremely worried about the changing climate, 74% impact on functioning. So this is really, a really important, impetus for us to really investigate, how climate change is affecting young people, for instance, and not just in terms of numbers. We need to investigate the live experiences, what they are really experiencing on the ground, and how are they coping, and what are the limits, the coping, especially in a continuously warming planet. Next, please. So, that's the planetary crisis part, the first P. The second P, of course, is pandemic crisis. Maybe in the States, people are now saying the pandemic is over. No one, very few people are wearing masks. But you go to the Philippines, it's still, a pressing, concern in cities, in rural areas. Vaccination coverage is far from being universal. So, the pandemic is not yet over in our part of the world. And that in itself, forget about climate, the pandemic in itself is still causing some form of anxiety or other forms of negative emotional responses. And so we're keeping the pandemic part in the Philippine study. Next, please. And then, I already alluded to the political crisis. And, the U.S. is going to have an election very soon. But a few months back, we just elected the son of a former dictator. And, that really created a lot of dissatisfaction and anxiety and even anger among young Filipinos as reflected on social media. And so we are adding questions, which is not included in the British study, although perhaps if the British study was held just a few months ago or a few weeks ago, they could have added a political dimension to it with a fast-changing leadership on the other side of the pond. But, for the Philippines, we're adding this dimension because it's very relevant. As you can see there, politics and elections, create these emotional camps and start political wars, which really affect especially the next generation. Next, please. So, pandemic, planetary, and political. And, this is what we're doing in the Philippine study. This is how we're framing the Philippine study. But I guess other countries can actually adopt the same framing, because elections and political crisis are happening, unfortunately, everywhere. And so, and I'm sure there are other peace or other forces that are driving, mental and emotional stress among young people of today. And we're really interested in how all of these, as individually, but also perhaps synergistically, are creating this, mental stresses that affect our young people. Next. So Emma already mentioned a while ago the YPAG, which is quite an innovation for this, changing world study. And, we have a very vibrant YPAG in the Philippines. We're very fortunate, and I guess this is part of the responses of the young people to the emerging climate challenge. Young people are coming together, mobilizing themselves, creating youth networks, either to address climate change or to address mental health, or both. And so we were very lucky to actually recruit members of the Young Persons Advisory Group very easily, and they've been very, generous in terms of providing inputs to the questionnaire, making sure that the questionnaire is not very long, but also very understandable for the young people of the Philippines. And we will be working with them until the very end. We're not just getting their inputs for the questionnaire and then forget them once the data has been collected and analysis has already begun. They are partners throughout the entire research journey. Next slide, please. And here we are also going to, show some examples of how we, I always tell Emma and our colleagues from Imperial, we need to Philippinize the questionnaire. And one way to Philippinize or to really bring it to the context is, one, to translate, right? The survey form, right? In the British study, it's not a problem, right? But in the Philippine study, a country with hundreds of languages, although, the majority of young people do speak Filipino, our national language. And so that is the first challenge, right? We need to translate the questionnaire into our own language. So, I'll not be reading the questions, but as you can see, there are, and we will be releasing two versions. Young people can choose either the English or the Filipino version, because while, the Philippines, well, many Filipinos speak the local language, Philippines is also a predominantly English-speaking country. Next, please. And then there are questions that are in the UK study that we felt, no one will be able to understand it in the Philippine context. For example, remember in the survey questionnaire, there's a section asking questions that relate to socioeconomic status. You can't ask young people directly how much they earn, right? But you can ask for, let's say, proxy indicators like a dishwasher. But a dishwasher is not, common even in high-income families in the country, right? I love dishwashing. That's like my therapy, after a very stressful day. And so instead, we ask the question, do you have flush toilets? Because unfortunately, in the Philippines, even middle-class people or slightly, those who are slightly under middle class do not have flush toilets at home. And that will give us an indication of, where they are in the socio-economic strata. Next, please. And then here, we made the question more specific, right? Because, for example, the term hurricane, that is not the term that we use in our country, but we use typhoon, we use, cyclone. And so, another way to kind of contextualize a UK questionnaire, for instance, is to really understand how is climate change manifesting in your reality and, converting those questions to make sure, that the young people do understand what you're asking. Next, please. And then here, we added election-related questions. When you think about the May 2022 national elections, how strongly do you feel each of the following emotions, if at all? So this, again, is the additional feature to our survey questionnaire. We've added several questions pertaining to how young people are reacting to the recently concluded elections. Next. And then we added some additional questions regarding coping mechanisms and intervention. So we just don't want to have an idea of what young people are experiencing. We want to have a clue as to what they're doing to relieve the stress. And so this is interesting because in the Philippines, they say that there's only one country in the world where McDonald's is not number one because we have Jollibee. That's their national fast food. And there's anecdotal, testimony saying that people, when they feel stressed, they go to Jollibee and they go out and they're happy. Well, that's why it's called Jollibee, right? And I can attest to that because their chicken is so good, although probably bad for non-communicable disease. And so we're really interested in asking young people, what are they doing, right? So we have a question on Jollibee, we have a question on karaoke, which is a Filipino pastime. We have a question on prayer because we're a very Catholic country. So these are some questions that we added to just have some clue as to what young people are doing to relieve the stress. But the hope is that this initial information will lead us to come up with more in-depth studies in the future. Because again, it's not just about knowing the magnitude of the problem. We want to identify interventions that will probably work. So next slide. That's it. We're going to launch our survey before the year ends. Fingers crossed that the IRB will give us the soonest approval. Thank you. And next is?
Thank you so much, Renzo. I think we're handing over to Sandeep and the Changing Lives Caribbean team. So welcome, Sandeep, to the stage. And it was wonderful to hear how the study has been contextualized in the Philippines. But now we're going to hand on to a team that's kind of gone through that process and then gone further at this point in collecting the data and sharing the results. So really, really keen to hear about what you've been finding out in the Caribbean, Sandeep.
Thanks, Emma. And as you can clearly see, coming from the Caribbean, I'm having my climate crisis myself, right? So we will move on. And there are some wonderful people that have really made this happen, and I can't go without mentioning them. For working with us closely, Quinta Sion, my research student from Queen's Elizabeth Scholarship out of McGill University. I have Dr. Natalie Graves, who you'll hear from a little later, Professor Simon Anderson, Dr. Mike Campbell, Dr. Paula Henry, Dr. Eden Augustus, Professor Donald Simeon, Professor Terence Mungle, whose name is not there, but for guidance, Professor Emmanuel Cummins, Ms. Leanne Kendall, Dr. Ans Backerman, and who you heard of, and Dr. Emma Lawrance, who you would have met as well. So thanks to them, because this body of work I'm going to present is all due to them. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So setting the context. This study looked at 3 Caribbean countries, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Barbados. And we are doing a truly hybrid event, so I will be doing the in-person, and Dr. Graves will speak about the qualitative side of things soon. And we surveyed persons between the age of 18 to 24. It was difficult to get ethical approval for persons at the age of 16 in the Caribbean. And we had a median age of 20.9 in it. And Trinidad and Tobago, obviously, was the country that gave 194 people. Guyana gave us 196, and Barbados gave us 86. Our original target was 663 persons, but due to, we had 802 respondents, but after cleaning the data, we found only 474 to be very valid for analysis. 62% of them were women, 34% men, and 2% were found and identified as non-binary in the Caribbean region. And major ethnic groups were found to be Afro-Caribbean persons, mixed Caribbean persons, as well as 27% were found to be of Indo-Caribbean origin. Most were living with their family, 88% of them, and most of them were educated. So 66% of the persons had post-secondary school education. Moving on, please. Thanks. And what we found here, 45% of the sample, when we look at what was their mental health status prior, 45% of the sample actually self-reported having a lifetime history of mental health illness. And this is an important finding to get outside in the Caribbean. And what we found, given a median level of 8 on the perceived stress scale, and there was moderate life satisfaction with only about 52 of them, 5.2% showing that there was life satisfaction. And there was a relatively high risk of anxiety among these people. where we found this was correlated with a recent study done by UNICEF in 2021. So there are some underlying issues which we need to deal with in the Caribbean. Could we move on, please? So when we look at how has COVID changed life for these people, and just like the UK study, we looked at the negative and positive. So persons were worried about their loved ones, persons were worried about the safety, persons were worried about their future, and there was a lack of leisure activities. Those they found to be negative. But being Caribbean as we are, we saw positive changes in avoiding people, right? And getting more sleep, time with family, and more time for phone and entertainment. So there were some positives as well. I don't know how positive they are, but we got to avoid a few people. Moving on. Moving on to the next slide. And youth who were generally involved in social distancing, but were going about their normal activities, felt low levels of stress compared to their counterparts who were placed in quarantine. Although this effect size was small, it was still significant at the end of the day. And obviously, it leads to further research and hypothesizing down. And also, we found the overall side effect for others were also found, for other subgroups was detected, but they were very small as well, so weren't reported. Can we move on? And when we look at climate change, the Caribbean, interestingly, they found the media coverage to be very negative and having an impact on their life. The extreme weather events, I thought that would have been first because we deal with the same things as the Philippines, hurricanes and so on. And then seeing the environment that they cannot change. So there's a feeling that they can't change this environment that they live in. And finally, there's significant worry about the future when it comes to climate change, seeing action. But there's some positives. They learn more about the environment. They think that's important. There's improved well-being through eco-friendliness that's taking place, inspiration to connect to nature. And as you know, the Caribbean is just nature. And also, persons actually, 31% of them felt very empowered to do something about it, which is very, very positive. Can we move forward, please? And when we look and you compare the emotions, we found some overlapping trends between climate change and COVID-19, which I like to really highlight here. There was, both of them brought forward helplessness. Persons were disgusted, afraid, outraged, angry, but they were hopeful and courageous that something could be done. But finally, a lot of them were disappointed in a lot that is taking place in there. So there's some overlapping themes that we found there. Can we move ahead? But this became very, very interesting. What do they see as important to them? And a lot of them see their financial situation in the Caribbean to be important to them, 52.7%. Work and career is also important to them, and school and studies were also important. Less often, climate change was 14.9% important to them, although it created some worry and so on, it's not too important. And as COVID-19, even though this was done at the height of the pandemic, 28.4% of them found it to be important. So, it's really something that we need to investigate further because there's something else coming out here, maybe political dimensions, as Renzo rightly said, and economic dimensions that we did not investigate. Could we go right ahead to the next slide? And coming out of the pandemic, what are the 5 major things that we need to do? As we can see, for them, they are looking for good jobs, good education, public safety, access to healthcare services, and they want a stronger economy and flexibility to work and study. That's what they want coming out of the pandemic. Can we move on? So finally, our interim conclusions are, young people who experience climate distress can derive benefits from focusing on findings, meaning in the present, they find like-minded individuals through collective action. So we have to continue with these young people groups, build that collective action, improve well-being by connecting with people and nature. So we have to really work towards that, and also achieving a sense of purpose and identity, which we need to work on, and that brings in that socioeconomic dimension. Being truly a hybrid event, I will now move on to my co-presenter who worked on some of the qualitative aspects, the wonderful Dr. Natalie Graves and Dr. Mike Campbell, who are out in Barbados, who will take over the screen now. Beautiful
Okay, so
island.
thanks very much for that, Sandeep, and I'm hopeful that everyone can hear me well. I'm coming to you from that little dot that you could not even see when he showed the map of the Caribbean. And our role in this work was to add a qualitative lens to the data that was collected. Now, for those of you who are keen on qualitative research, I'm hopeful that you will forgive us for some things because this was not a purely qualitative study. We applied qualitative methodology to some free response questions that were embedded within the cross-sectional survey. But we must say that some very deep data came out. At first, it might appear that what can you really get from free response short answer questions? But what we did, we applied a thematic construct to that. So of the 400 plus persons that responded, 124 persons gave quite expansive answers in the three open-ended questions. And those three open-ended questions, I'm going to use my cursor here, really explore the psychological responses to climate change and COVID, and also their personal behaviors and actions. And there was quite a bit of articulation as it relates to the hope for the future. Now, with any good qualitative project, for you to understand the initial analysis that we're presenting, we need to tell you who we are. So the data was analyzed by persons who are Caribbean nationals. So my colleague and Mike, he's here. I have a public health background. Mike has a psychology background. And what we did a theory-based deductive coding in the first instance, drawing on literature that already existed. We constructed the data dictionary and then applied that to the data set, double coding 15% of the data by hand. And then we divided up the entire data set and coded independently, resulting in some interesting, robust discussion with resolution of differences, resulting in formulation of 7 basic themes, 4 organizing themes, and 1 global theme. So we're going to go to the next slide, where we're going to show you where we essentially believe that this work lies. And it's very interesting where Sandeep left off and where Renzo was, because we really believe that the understanding of the findings cannot be separated from the fact that we as human beings, we are sharing a biosphere. We have a shared biosphere, and we cannot separate out the experiences of youth from the socio and political environment in which they live. And what we fundamentally found was a sense of fear accompanied by agency and also resiliency and hopefulness. And the 4 thematic constructs that we want to share with you today revolve around the fact that many of the youth were balancing their own externally directed actions, and they were trying to influence persons within their spheres of influence. I'll say influence twice in the same sentence. But in addition to that, while they were doing their own part, they expected a certain level of leadership and governance and responsibility, both from political leaders, but also from the corporate world. And you would think that this was a very interesting construct because it could not be divorced from the fact that although at times there were deep themes of pessimism and resignation because of the environment that they lived in terms of the physical environment, the climate change, etc., the political, social environment, youth were still able to maintain their personal dreams and goals, etc. And I think the solutions that we're going to come up with have to be hinged around how do we help to maintain this relationship between, yes, the reality of the world that we live in, modifying our agency and accelerating our agency, while also shifting the socio-political environment in which youth live. Now, I had hoped to share some themes and some direct quotes. I'm not sure if we were able to do it. Yes, a prize to Anne for sure. I just said this to her like at the last minute. And I just wanted to share some of the very strong thoughts. You will notice that in the Caribbean, we have a very diverse population. And this young lady, she was a 21-year-old African Caribbean female from Barbados. And I thought this was very powerful because she's calling here on the responsibility of governments to act, and also act using accurate scientific information. And I just want to switch down to the other one that's highlighted in gray, where this particular participant, a 22-year-old African Caribbean female from Trinidad and Tobago. She mentions her personal things, that the personal external actions that she is doing. She talks about using menstrual cups and bamboo menstrual pads, modifying the way how she uses bottled water, etc. But this is just an example of a person manipulating, or not manipulating, but influencing their personal sphere. But as we said, the data showed that you could almost see a socio-ecological model being beautifully operationalized by these young persons in this study. So this particular young lady, she's talking about menstrual cups and bamboo pads. And then we have another young man, an 18-year-old Indian Caribbean male, who has definitely taken his level of action to the sphere of the community. Next slide, as we conclude. And I just want to, I can say as a researcher, it was difficult reading some of the data that related to how pessimistic and resigned some of our youth are. There's elements of anxiety, of fear, disillusionment, etc. And I just want to read as it is. This person still manages to maintain some level of hopefulness while still understanding that there's a deep trajectory and deep despair. I shouldn't say that they maintain hopefulness, because actually this one is quite despondent. So I apologize if it seems like it's too dark, but he says, I'm not hopeful for us as a species. We are stuck on a trajectory of death and despair. It is my belief that the world will end soon and there really is no future. So I therefore have no aspirations left and just wait every day for the end. And that is not an isolated experience. And I think that this is very important to understand the reality of small island developing states with our vulnerabilities, our political or economic vulnerabilities, and the fact that we are living through a climate crisis. But while this person said that they had no particular hope for the future, we did still, and it's important to present both sides and both experiences, where we did have persons still resonating with the fact that they wanted to maintain their educational output, their educational dreams and aspirations, even after the pandemic, the hope for securing jobs, and all within the context of being able to take care of their family members and also secure a future for themselves. So this is all very preliminary, but we thought it was very powerful, and so powerful that we could not keep it quiet. The fact that there is this deep darkness, but in spite of the fear, the anxiety, etc., there's a level of agency and a level of resilience that we as climate activists and researchers need to foster and contribute to the formation of solutions. So that's where we're going to end, and we look forward to engaging with you in the question and answer period.
Incredible. Thank you so much to the whole Caribbean team, to Sandeep and Natalie and Mike and all of the many other people involved in Quinta, and all the wonderful researchers that Sandeep mentioned at the start. It's been a pleasure to work with you all over the last sort of years now. So I would love to now pass on to Britt Ray, joining us from Stanford in the US, and she'll be joining us by video, but is also here live. I just wanted to reiterate, as Natalie said, if there's questions, you can add, if you're joining online, you can add to the Q&A function. If there's questions in the room, please feed them to one of the Changing Worlds representatives in the room, and we'll do our best to respond throughout the rest of the event. So on to you, Britt.
Well, thank you so much for that. And hi, everybody. My name is Britt Ray, and before I jump into the results of the Changing World US study, I'll make a few key remarks about how our survey is different from the UK pilot, and how we made adaptations for our study based on the local national context of the United States. So firstly, scholarship around climate change and mental health is moving quickly because researchers are trying to keep up with our fast advancing ecological crisis. New measures
Please pin the video if you can on the virtual screen. Thank you.
And eco-anxiety emerged after the first pilot in the UK was completed and before we started our survey about a year later. And so in the US study, we took the opportunity to incorporate a new scale called the Hogg Eco-Anxiety Scale that wasn't in the UK pilot, which asks participants about their eco-emotional experiences, rumination, behavioral symptoms, and anxiety about one's own negative impact on the planet. We also asked our participants about how they are coping with climate change by including a psychological adaptation scale, as well as some adapted questions from the healthcare setting that relate to meaning-focused coping. And lastly, due to the growing conversation in the media, as well as in activist movements around how climate concerns are shaping young people's future thinking, we asked participants whether their feelings about climate change are impacting important future considerations, such as whether to have children, whether they desire to travel to see places before they think they might disappear due to climate change, whether they think saving money for the future is still important, and so on. And because the United States has been directly impacted by several climate hazards, such as wildfires, hurricanes, and floods in recent years that have touched the lives of millions of people, which is dissimilar in a way from the United Kingdom, when recruiting participants, we oversampled in counties where individuals were more likely to have directly experienced climate impacts, so that we could then ask questions about how direct experience shapes a young person's psychological experiences of climate change, as compared with individuals who do not perceive themselves as yet having been directly touched by the climate crisis. In order to get our sample, we used Qualtrics, a professional survey panel service, to recruit participants from across the US so that our participant pool closely mirrored the US Census regarding breakdown of ethnicity. We obtained a total of 2,883 valid responses after quality control. And the respondents were between 16 and 24 years old, with a mean of 20 years old. Half of them identified as women, 44% as men, and 5% as gender nonconforming. We had a fairly large percentage of people who identified as LGBTQ+, more than a quarter. Now, most respondents were either studying or combining study with work, and the vast majority, nearly 90%, lived in metropolitan areas. We also asked whether they had ever been diagnosed with a mental health condition or had received treatment, which was the case for nearly 34% of the sample. In terms of climate distress, which measures a general sense of concern over climate change, the majority of the sample was moderately distressed, about 57% of them, and a minority was highly distressed, nearly 13%. On the other hand, when we looked at eco-anxiety, it was pretty low in the sample. The Hogg eco-anxiety scale is closer to a clinical measure that relates to what we see in generalized anxiety disorder, and it captures multidimensional anxiety symptoms along 4 subscales: affect, rumination, behavior, and functional impact. And on a scale of 0 to 3, where 3 is rated high, all of these subscales were at roughly 1 for the entire sample. We also found a moderate impact on daily tasks, such as sleeping and concentrating, so there was some functional interference. The most commonly reported negative responses and impacts of climate change in the lives of the sample were seeing coverage in the media of the changes that are happening, such as loss of species and ice caps melting, seeing natural environments that you care about change for the worst, and experiencing more extreme weather events in the places where they live. It was also followed by worry, concern, or frustration about how other people aren't doing their part, and feeling frustrated about the lack of control, or feeling that opportunities to do something about climate change are limited. But there were also some positive impacts of climate change in these young people's lives. They reported having more opportunities to learn about the natural world and how it changes, feeling inspired to live a more eco-friendly life with improved health and well-being, as well as feeling inspired to connect more with the natural world. These were the top 3 rated positive impacts. And when looking at self-reported emotions as they relate to climate change, respondents most often felt concerned, interested, disappointed, frustrated, sad, anxious, and angry. And the sample had an overall neutral to positive sense of agency in the climate crisis. So they reported high levels of awareness of the actions that one can take in order to mitigate climate change, as well as high subjective assessment of their own individual capacity to take part in these kinds of mitigating actions. But they also scored high on the sense that taking action has a positive effect on how one thinks and feels, so a well-being improvement tag-along effect. But the scores were rather neutral on many other dimensions of agency, suggesting that the sample largely feels ambiguous about other core components of agency, like their ability to influence others or control the problem, or act with urgency or take on responsibility. Finally, a strength of this study is that we had a large number of respondents who had experienced direct impacts of climate change because, as I said, we oversampled in areas that have been experiencing wildfires, hurricanes, floods, air pollution, that sort of thing. And by splitting the sample into those who had reported being directly affected versus those who felt they still had not been directly affected by climate change, we discovered many interesting, significant relationships. Self-assessed direct exposure affected all of our outcome variables, meaning that direct experience of climate impacts predicts higher climate distress, higher eco-anxiety, higher daily interference on functioning from climate thoughts and feelings, but also greater coping skills such as psychological adaptation and meaning-focused coping, which points to the need for more research on post-traumatic growth in order to understand this transformational element of what it might mean to live with climate change. Direct experiences also affected young people's considerations for their futures in significant ways. For example, about a fifth of the sample reported questioning having children because of climate change when we looked at those who had not yet been directly impacted. But this jumped to a third of the sample when looking at those who had been directly impacted. Similar increases were seen across most of the future planning questions. So those who had been directly impacted were more likely to want to educate themselves in ways that their school is currently not in order to feel more prepared for a climate changed future. They were more likely to want to travel to see places before they might disappear. And they were more likely to think that saving money for the future is pointless. I'm going to leave it here for now. And with that, I'll pass it over to our next team to hear about their study in the Global Changing Worlds Consortium. Thanks so much.
We got a
Hi,
question in the
Sandy.
room.
Yep.
Hi, Emma. We got a question in the room. Jeremy?
Oh, can we get a microphone to him? Sorry.
Yeah, I think, we'll ask you to come up and...
Hi, this is Jeremy from the Planetary Health Alliance. Hi, Emma. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you.
I may have missed this in the beginning, but I'm curious. I think this is all fascinating. So what is the next step, the goal of these studies? I know Philippines is to start, but for the ones that have been completed. And also, have you considered, for example, in the UK, follow-up study that these studies might actually increase awareness or purpose or people wanting to take action just by participating? I found that, for Bausi Coalition, they do art projects and then the youth actually want to then start taking action within climate change or other areas. So I guess that's two questions in one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I might jump in and then open it up to others. So just to say from the global perspective in terms of what we're trying to achieve in next steps, I think it's really important to, we wanted to get some understanding where, there is more research coming out over the last years alongside the work that we've been doing, but there's still not really a baseline understanding of these issues, of how many young people are feeling and having these different experiences in response to these different crises, and obviously particularly interested in the climate emergency. And so our first sort of priority was to get that understanding and also to understand how we could adapt, amend, work in these different contexts and see how the sort of similarities and differences across contexts as well. But as you say, this is very fast evolving, and each of us as individuals knows that the way that we think and feel about the climate crisis might fluctuate within the course of a day. It's changing over time. It changes with our experiences of engagement with it. And we saw very strongly across sites that engagement with the crisis is understandably engenders distress, but that is not wholly negative and shouldn't be pathologized, of course, because it's understandable, it's valid, but it also importantly seems to be strongly related to agency, and that there is opportunities to help people to remain in a place where they can cope and that they can act, and not sort of tip over into the the levels of despair that may be really, really negative for mental health and well-being. And so one thing I think that we all want to do is better understand those coping strategies and what can really help in the different contexts to move into and use this to inform interventions. So we have a co-designed guided journal in the UK. I know the Caribbean team is looking to move on to working to adapt that, but obviously would like to pass on and let you hear from them. And so we're working in the different contexts to also look at, well, what interventions are appropriate? How can we adapt the work that we've done on interventions in the UK to different contexts? And also look longitudinally, like you say, and develop what are the key metrics that we could look at over time to get a sort of an ongoing picture and snapshot and track this kind of experiences. And we also see in the US that direct experiences seem to really change these outcomes. And we know that the groups with direct experience will differ across countries, which is probably why, you know, distress is so high in the Philippines, for example, at a global scale. But also that group is going to grow over time. So it's really important that we track that. But, you know, fundamentally, we have no funding for this study. It's all been done with the generosity of the collaborators and working kind of in partnership over time to kind of build this capacity. But we are very much sort of hindered by a lack of funding, which I think has been a lack for the planetary community, the planetary health community, sorry, in general. And hopefully that tide is turning as awareness is raised and this issue gets on more funders' agenda. So hopefully we can, you know, generate that resource and continue to do this work with these groups, you know, as a consortium and also with others. But I will open it up to who else wants to jump in from any of the speakers. I think Sandeep's coming up.
Yeah, Emma, just to clarify two things. One is that in the Caribbean, for example, one of our major partners is the Caribbean Center for Health System Development and Policy. So once we have finally finished all our analyses, we'll obviously have them work from research to policy documents to get to governments. So that's one. The second thing that was important in the Caribbean, it was the first time some of these scales were actually utilized in the Caribbean. So it actually allows for some baseline data to be put out there in that regard, as well as something we have not done yet, but we also have to do is look at potentially validating these things within the Caribbean region. And as Emma rightly said, we are looking to recruit a smaller group with a guided journal to look at the impacts of climate change on them and contextualizing that in the Caribbean setting. So that's the follow-up work that is expected to happen with us going forward. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in?
Renzo here. I can add a bit more, I mean, as to the next phase, right? And yes, there are research questions that for sure will be generated by these, in a way, baseline studies that we're conducting across the different countries. But also, I think, you know, one potential, you know, function of this first set of studies also is to generate you know, a lot of interest and awareness in our respective regions and countries. So for example, in the Philippines, we're really building a community of climate change and mental health researchers, advocates, and practitioners. And in order for that community to be developed, we need some baseline, you know, numbers and some baseline understanding so we can really bring people together, you know, not just mental health and specialists and psychologists, but also people, colleagues from the climate science, the climate adaptation sector, you know, the youth engagement sector. So there's so many sectors, and ultimately this subject matter is a very transdisciplinary issue and topic. The other part, and I think Sandeep already alluded to this as well, is, you know, we can already use this initial evidence to inform policy change. You know, the climate clock is ticking. Young people are now, you know, feeling, you know, different kinds of emotions, from anxiety to anger to disgust towards the failures of policy and governments. And so if we have these concrete numbers, you know, being, develop, through research, then we can influence, national governments. I sit in the mini IPCC of the Philippines, and I'm the only one. I'm the youngest person in that 16-person panel, but also I'm one of the only 2 health people in a panel of 16 scientists. And so, I've been really strongly advocating for, a strong emphasis on the mental health impacts of climate change as part of climate adaptation. And, government, if you don't show the numbers, they will not act on it. So what gets measured, gets done, gets addressed. So that's also another function of, these kinds of cross-sectional survey studies. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Renzo. Just for the interest of time, we might need to move on, but thank you so much for everyone sharing questions. And hopefully that there'll be continued discussion in the room and in the coming days after this. And we'd love to kind of continue to engage with you also if you reach out to us online. So I'm going to welcome Gary Belkin now to hopefully the in-person stage to talk about, again, sort of fading on from that question, actually, what do we do with what we know? How do we respond to this? So Gary's leading a huge effort to actually, make this kind of response happen at scale. Over to you, Gary. And just to also say, Gary was part of the US study as well.
You've heard an incredible richness of work, and what that reflects is an incredible network of workers. And this is part and parcel of how we have to progress this topic, is by creating these kinds of hubs and spokes of learning and action loops. And I'm going to talk about this organization, this network of organizations, COP Square, which really is trying to harness this explosion of interest in this topic, but also this explosion of operationalizing these knowledge action loops, because that's how we have to progress on this topic. I was privileged to work on a bit on the U.S. study. Britt really leading the way with Hans and Emma. And so I'm grateful for that experience, but I'm really grateful for this network, because they were a nidus for growing what is COP Squared, which I'll describe a bit more. 3 takeaways that I got listening to all this in one sitting, because I've heard bits and pieces of this work. One is the diversity of emotional experience. And I think we shouldn't try to oversimplify that diversity in terms of finding patterns. And I'm also thinking of the Mentimeter, as that was called, at the outset, which also had, tired, exasperated, as well as energized, optimistic. That is our emotional landscape. It is psychological whiplash from here forward. And that is a different kind of governing. It's a different kind of thinking about care systems. It's a different kind about thinking about community and our relations to each other and what it means to support each other. And that's the terrain we're facing. A second big takeaway, and it's really from the exposure, that there's a dose effect of the intensification of the highs and lows of that diversity of the landscape in terms of exposure to climate harms. So we're in for a rough ride, but a potentially transformative ride. And then the third is, that diversity, and this really picks up on Renzo's last points, is it's going to take a village to understand this and to act on it. The work of mental health is changed. It is not about going to a provider, it's about building communities that create a social fabric that can help cope and act at the same time with some nimbleness as circumstances change. So what we're trying to do with COP Squared is reflect that village that's growing. We're now, it occurred to me, COP Squared I think has been 3 to 4 months old, and we have almost 250 organizations and growing that are working at this in some way or another. They're grassroots activists, they're researchers, they're folks who've been doing mental health, community mental health on the ground for ages. They're youth activists who just discovered that this is a real part of their activism. People who are working on sustainability governance and well-being measures are finding that emotional well-being tends to be at the core of implementing and problem solving. And so, next slide. So we know that there's a lot of literature and evidence out there on what I'll call the usual mental illness conversation, which we can't lose sight of. Because that evidence shows, and if you want to take your screenshot now for a kind of climate and mental illness 101, here are some really big sources, including the last IPCC report, is that all these exposures multiply the levels and prevalence of the major categories of measurable mental illness: depression, anxiety, substance use, and so forth. So there is a capacity issue, there is a morbidity burden issue at the bottom of all of this that we have to be ready for, because it's only growing. But as you heard from the presentations today, it's more than that. There is a not just mental health and measurable stress, there's also collective distress and damage and burden, for which the mental health story is a key and unavoidably necessary factor to take into account. Next slide. If you aren't close followers of annual UNDP Human Development Reports, start becoming one with the latest report. This report said, and I quote, that mental well-being is under assault globally, which impairs humanity's ability to, quote, face the demands of shaping our future in a transforming world. I've been working in global mental health for a couple of decades, and I've not seen this kind of other sector alarm as to where an enlarged sense of emotional, mental, psychological work and damage is put at the center of so many of our common projects. And I'm thinking again, Renzo, of your, including the, the political element and these other forces that affect mental morbidity, is what is also striking about the UNDP report is they get and they share the evidence that shows that there's an opposite direction as well. The state of mental health affects the political environment, affects the actionable environment on doing collective work around problem solving on climate and environmental challenges. And so the political and the psychological have always been intertwined, but now at stake is our ability as communities to withstand incredible stress tests that are not just individual but collective, and these are stress tests we have to pass. So how does this enlarged, and there's some really interesting literature, if you want a one-stop shop around some really creative thinking about the psychological roots of climate change, it's of the climate crisis, it's Sally Weintraub's book by that title, which really links in a big picture this sense that we have to think about the ways our society stacks the deck in favor or against caring ways of thinking and emoting and connecting. And that is our project. How we nurture each other affects how we're capable as communities of nurturing the planet and vice versa. So there's a lot at stake in terms of direct, greater need for mental health, mental illness help, but that agenda is now very enlarged to encompass how successful we're going to be in working together collectively through these problems. And so have to be taken not just to an individual care level, but to a community social care, what I call the social climate level. Next slide. So this means seeing mental health not as something that applies to, if you see bell curve at any given moment in a population, the degree of mental health morbidity or burden, mental illness, is to think of the work of mental health as not applying to the folks on the bottom left of this curve, those with mental disorder, but actually as being builders of psychological resources in communities. And that we collectively think about psychological resources and as critical infrastructure, the way we do other infrastructures. And to see and build our knowledge and take from the data we're hearing and go forth to ask new questions, to be around that project. How do we deepen the reservoir of psychological resources in our communities? Because that runs the gamut of facing deep grief and trauma to having the wherewithal of social trust and collective efficacy and social ties. What we talk about as mental health has to cover that bandwidth. So, how are we going to do that? Next slide. So one is we have to create the right village that brings together this diversity that is going to have to take us to build a better social climate. You know, I observe often that it took the IPCC decades to come up with an Earth climate science, weaving together whole sets of different disciplines to try to explain how the Earth climate worked and thus what we can do to make it work better. We need the same for a social climate science, but we don't have decades. And in fact, a social climate science will include a far greater diversity of disciplines and participants and voices, the participation of civil society. It's actually a more complex project, but it's one we have to take on. So COP squared, I guess one way of describing it was trying to bring together what many of us heard was growing globally. This was not just a global North phenomenon. This is a global South phenomenon of organizations that are working at this nexus of climate change and mental health. And so we brought them together initially to try to create a workspace, a networking space, to start bringing these strands together and to come to some ways of defining where there was consensus of things that should be picked up and taken up by policymakers at a global and national level. We have, again, in 3-4 months, started on that path. Our work engines for trying to bring and converge these strands of experience and approaches to this issue. The working engines for that are really going to be regional hubs. One other reason why I'm grateful for this research team is it has given us several hub leads, including Renzo and Emma. And as we were trying to think, and we're still thinking about how do we in fact use those hubs as ways of really capturing, synergizing, converging, accelerating, growing, connecting these pieces that really need to flourish but converge together. We made the case, we got ahead of ourselves instead of maturing that process to have impact on global level governance and decision making, is we made the case of the need to do this with the Race to Resilience, which is an effort within the UNFCCC framework. There'll be more about it at this next COP next week. But it is an effort to really try to mobilize a lot of civil society and other action to work on adaptation, to really accelerate local work on adaptation globally, particularly in the most highly vulnerable parts of the world that touch 4 billion lives, and to build that capacity and do that adaptation work at that scale by 2030. We made the case that you need resilient people to make resilient places. Adaptation tends to be a discussion about hardware, about building infrastructure that's physical and systems. But as you've gotten a taste of the snapshots of research of how people are feeling, we're not going to succeed at that if we're not also taking care of the human software and the emotional psychological resilience broadly construed that's needed for communities to step up to that work. So we'll be joining with the Race to Resilience at COP27 to talk about how we will be bringing that element into the race to resilience, which is, I think, quite an extraordinary and exciting development. Next slide. We have lots of experience to lean on how to do that. This is a doable goal, to build capacity to grow emotional and psychological resilience to 4 billion people by 2030. There's a rich background that I come from in the global mental health space, for example, which has shown how so many skills across that spectrum of acute issues to resilience building, those skills can be put in the hands of non-specialists, of non-clinicians, of everybody. I took that learning to scale when I was Deputy Health Commissioner in New York City, something called Thrive NYC. Here's a map of New York City. All those dots are geolocated locations where we were skilling up daycare providers and teachers and clergy and homeless shelter staff and job training program counselors to do the work of mental health, from the acute end to the mental health promoting and resilience building, and which brought in a whole array of intersectoral partnerships and other city agencies. The kinds of, again, as Renzo was describing, this is the village we not only need to build to learn more, it's the kind of village we need to build and operationalize and scale to do more. And there were just a whole number of examples. I just threw ones that I've been involved with, either directly or incidentally, that show that community coalitions can be marshaled to do this work of well-being and promotion. So it's a matter of how we scale it globally and how we fit it, particularly with efforts going on now globally in adaptation at community levels. Next slide. Again, if you want to take a snapshot of a 101 of research on these skill transfers that can handle everything from serious depression to more mental health promotion, nurturing effect, resilience building sorts of skills and methods that can be diffused throughout community settings. Here's a good first reading list. Next. And there are 250 organizations and growing. Each one of them are innovating how to build those dots. Each one of those are coming at this issue and reinventing the ways that we can put the work of emotional resilience and psychological strength building of communities in the hands of community members. And this is really what we're going to lean on as we work to bring into at the levels of action that are happening globally on adaptation and resilience building, this kind of resilience building based on the intelligence of the work going on. That's what COP Squared was built to do, was to network this social innovation that's going on in these multiple perspectives to come together and impact these larger global-led processes. And I think there's one more slide. So in addition to getting input from this growing community of interest, we're also going to build out our hubs, which I mentioned, as both facilitators of connecting dots, helping broker partnerships, and facilitating on the ground how these clusters of collaboration work, while also bringing in the full input of community partners such as R250 that are doing that work. So we look forward to the knowledge action loops that we've just started with our membership and with the work that you've heard today to mainstream this work into the really hard work of governing the human future into the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Gary, and it's been a pleasure to work with you and in developing COP Squared and to being a hub leader as Climate Cares, but also sort of watching and nurturing this growth of COP Squared, hearing and talking to you, and it's just been amazing, the growth in the last month. So it's incredibly exciting what's to come in this space. So anyone who's not involved, get involved. It's a very, very fast growing, inclusive, and very, very exciting space. So thank you so, so much for everyone who's attended today. I know we're slightly over time. We did have some more reflection questions for you. We were going to share them through the Menti, but we might have run out of time for that. But just to sort of share what those questions were, if you can maybe think and talk among yourselves, we wanted you to think about having heard from the different partners, and we have other partners in India who didn't join today, but this is a growing sort of planetary health movement of trying to understand and respond to this wide understanding of experiences that people are having in different settings in response to the climate crisis and interconnected crises. So we wanted to get you to think about, in your own context, what are the important factors you might consider that might be affecting young people and indeed everyone in your context. So Renzo, for example, described some of the local factors that would influence or may influence both the experiences and the distress and the different emotions and agency in response to climate change and the pandemic and the politics in the Philippines, but also the different coping strategies that might be coming into play in the Philippines. And similarly, the other context described how this is coming out in the results and in the direct experiences people are having and how this is shaping the work. And that's why we work very, very closely with young people in shaping the work and interpreting the work. But please consider what you might need to consider in your own local context in exploring these kind of topics and also in responding to them. And finally, we just wanted you to also reflect on what your key takeaways are from this session. We hope that there's been some nugget of inspiration, some new message, some new piece of data, some new way of working that has offered you something here today. We would love to hear what those are. So I can open up the Menti if anyone wanted to go in and continue to kind of share, across the questions. Those are there for you to respond to, and then others can see as well what's going on there, and we would love to read them later, what your takeaways are and the considerations in your local context. But otherwise, we hope this sparks further discussions at the Planetary Health Alliance annual meeting. I wish I could be there. I'll be in COP next week if anyone is there and would love to meet on the ground. A huge, huge thanks to the Planetary Health Alliance for hosting this and to all of the incredible collaborators and colleagues that you've heard from today and that we've worked with over the last years at Climate Cares. We would love to hear from any of you in the room virtually. If you've got any follow-up questions and comments, please do get in touch. And thank you so, so much for joining for what is quite a long, but hopefully really, really informative session. So thank you again.